Somewhere in the 20th century, economics stopped sounding like a conversation about people and started sounding like a physics lecture. And that shift wasn't just academic, it changed the language of power. Decisions that shape your rent, your wages, your debt, your food prices started being framed as technical necessities, not political choices, as if inflation, unemployment, crises, inequality weren't human problems anymore, but equation problems. And here's the part most people miss. Economics didn't become scientific because society demanded it. It became scientific because someone found a way to give it authority, a way to make the discipline speak in a voice that couldn't be challenged, a voice that didn't sound like opinion, but like law. Welcome to the hard ground of financial history, where money, power, and time collide. Nothing here is as simple as it looks. And to understand why Paul Samuelson matters so much, we have to understand the moment he arrived in. If you want more episodes like this, stories about how the world really works, make sure you subscribe. Because this isn't just about economics, it's about who gets to explain reality and who has to live inside it. When classical economics hit a wall, the early 20th century wasn't a great time to be an economist. Classical theory promised stability. It said markets were self-correcting. It said people behaved rationally. It said that over time, everything naturally moved toward balance. And then reality arrived. The Great Depression hit like a demolition hammer. Production collapsed. Unemployment exploded, banks failed, families lost everything, and the existing economic framework couldn't deliver a solution fast enough or convincingly enough. That's where John Maynard Keynes entered the room and broke a taboo. He argued something deeply uncomfortable. Markets could stay irrational longer than people could stay financially alive, and that sometimes governments had to intervene aggressively to stabilize demand. This wasn't a gentle suggestion, it was a direct confrontation with the idea that markets automatically heal themselves, and at least politically and practically, it worked. But Keynesian economics still felt human, too human. It was about psychology, fear, panic, uncertainty. Keynes was obsessed with what he famously called animal spirits, the emotional engine inside markets, the invisible force that turns optimism into bubbles and caution into collapses. Keynes didn't treat the economy like a machine. He treated it like a crowd. But for a certain kind of person, this was a problem. Because if economics is human, then it's messy, debatable, unpredictable. And that kind of economics can't easily claim the authority of science. The world wanted authority. After World War II, the world wanted something different. Governments were bigger, institutions were stronger, policy decisions needed justification. Economics wasn't just a philosophy anymore, it wasn't a debate club. It had become infrastructure. Governments needed economics to guide ministries, central banks, global systems. And for that, economics had to look official, reliable, precise. It had to speak with authority. This wasn't a conversation, it was an engineering problem. And that's where Paul Samuelson enters the story. Samuelson, not a revolutionary, a system builder. Samuelson wasn't a revolutionary like Marx. He wasn't a political disruptor like Keynes. He wasn't trying to overthrow capitalism or redesign society. He did something more subtle and, in the long run, far more influential. He built a system. Samuelson was a young genius with a deep admiration for mathematics and physics, and he believed economics had a credibility problem. It talked too much and proved too little. If physics could describe planetary motion with equations, why couldn't economics describe markets the same way? In 1947, Samuelson published a book whose title alone revealed his ambition: Foundations of Economic Analysis. This wasn't a book of political opinions. It was an attempt to give economics formal structure. a unified framework that could explain consumer behavior, firm behavior, market outcomes, using the same underlying logic. And the core idea was deceptively simple. People optimize, consumers maximize utility, firms maximize profit, markets coordinate these decisions, and under certain conditions. The system moves toward equilibrium. These weren't meant as moral claims, they were modeling assumptions, simplifications, a language, a way to make economics expressible mathematically. And this is where many people misunderstand Samuelson. He wasn't saying humans are perfectly rational. He was saying that if you assume rationality, your models become clean, elegant, powerful. And once that assumption is accepted, economics becomes something else entirely because when economists borrowed math from physics, they borrowed physics confidence too. Suddenly, economics could produce sharp predictions. Prices responded to incentives. Supply met demand. Shocks were temporary deviations from a stable baseline. The economy became something that could be analyzed like a machine. Adjusted, tuned, fixed. The neoclassical synthesis, a compromise. Everyone could live with one of Samuelson's most important contributions was what became known as the neoclassical synthesis. Instead of replacing classical economics, it reconciled it with Keynes. The logic was simple. Markets are generally efficient at allocating resources, but sometimes they break. When they break, governments can step in to stabilize demand. And when stability returns, markets take over again. This was a compromise that made almost everyone happy. Free markets stayed intact. Government intervention became legitimate, but limited. Economics now had a unified story. It could be taught, published, defended, and it was taught. Samuelson's introductory textbook, Economics, an Introductory Analysis, became one of the most influential economics books ever written. For decades, it trained generations of students who would go on to run central banks, financial institutions, universities, governments. Samuelson didn't just explain economics, he defined what economics was. And that's where the change became permanent. Because once a framework becomes curriculum, it stops being questioned. Models become default. Assumptions become invisible. Alternative ways of thinking start to look not just different, but unprofessional. Economics gained precision, legitimacy, power. But something else was quietly lost. What got erased? Human messiness. As economics became more formal, it pushed certain realities into the background. Human behavior became stylized. Power dynamics were minimized. Psychology became noise. Crises were framed not as features of the system, but as anomalies. Economics stopped talking to people and started talking about people. Samuelson didn't do this out of malice. He genuinely believed economics should improve human welfare. But his success created a discipline that increasingly trusted its models more than its subjects. The moment economics learned to speak with authority, it also learned to speak with distance. And that distance still defines modern life. You can feel it in the way financial systems operate, in how policy decisions are justified, in why so many people experience economics not as something done with them, but something done to them. Models stopped being tools and became shields. Once Samuelson's language settled in, it didn't just change how markets were understood, it changed how power justified itself. Models became more than tools. They became shields. Central banks, finance ministries, international institutions adopted Samuelson's language because it offered something irresistible: clarity. If economic behavior could be reduced to optimization and equilibrium, then policy could be framed not as political preference, but as technical necessity. Decisions were no longer moral or ideological. They were simply what the model says. This is where modern economics found both its authority and its blind spot. The Samuelsonian worldview assumed stability was the default condition. Shocks where external crises were exceptions. Markets generally moved toward equilibrium. And when they didn't, the problem wasn't the framework. It was insufficient data or a temporary distortion. The solution wasn't deeper doubt, it was better calibration. And in calm periods, this approach worked. Inflation could be managed, growth could be predicted, trade offs could be optimized. Economics became essential for governments trying to manage complex societies. But the framework struggled with events that refused to behave politely. The system doesn't always want to be a machine bubbles, crashes, panics, systemic failures. These didn't fit equilibrium thinking very well. They were too emotional, too nonlinear, too human. Modern economics often treated these events not as fundamental features of financial systems, but as unfortunate deviations from how the system should work. And that had consequences. When markets overheated, models underestimated risk. When leverage accumulated, it often stayed invisible in aggregate statistics. When confidence collapsed, it happened faster than the equations could update. And when crisis hit, institutions had to respond to realities their own frameworks had minimized. 2008. The moment. The tension exploded. The 2008 global financial crisis exposed this tension brutally. Highly advanced models said risk was properly priced until it wasn't. Assumptions about diversification, rational behavior, and market liquidity failed at the same time. The problem wasn't a lack of intelligence, it was overconfidence in a narrow lens. When the system cracked, the response wasn't to question the foundations, it was to patch the structure. Liquidity was injected, interest rates were cut, balance sheets expanded, emergency measures were justified as temporary, and then became permanent. For more than a decade, dependence on emergency tools was treated as stability. And that's where Samuelson's legacy becomes complicated. Because on one hand, modern economics enabled unprecedented coordination. Without formal models, the crisis response could have been chaos. Policy needed structure. Markets needed reassurance. Technical language helped prevent total collapse. But on the other hand, the distance between economic decision makers and ordinary people widened. When policies were framed as mathematical necessities, public trust eroded. People experienced inflation, asset bubbles, inequality not as unfortunate side effects, but as signals that the system was built for someone else. Economics spoke confidently. People felt excluded. The irony. Samuelson understood uncertainty more than his followers. Here's the irony. Samuelson himself understood uncertainty better than many of his intellectual heirs. He knew models were simplifications. He warned against taking them too literally. But once a framework becomes institutionalized, caution disappears. Precision survives. Humility does not. Compare that with Keynes, one who insisted economists should be humble enough to admit what they don't know. Or with thinkers who stressed how power and status distort markets in ways models struggle to capture. Or with Adam Smith, who never separated economics from moral consequences. Samuelson didn't erase these thinkers, but he shifted the center of gravity. Economics became something done by experts, using tools ordinary people weren't meant to question. The language became cleaner, the models sharper, and the human chaos that once defined economic life was pushed to the side. That's why modern debates about inflation, debt, and financial stability often feel disconnected from lived experience. People aren't wrong to feel uneasy. They're responding to a system that optimized precision at the expense of empathy. The real solution: Don't burn the models. Remember what they are. Rejecting modern economics completely would be a mistake. The answer isn't to abandon models, it's to remember what they are. Maps are not territories. Samuelson gave economics a powerful map, detailed enough to guide policy across massive systems. But no map captures every street, every obstacle, every human reaction. When institutions forget that, they stop navigating and start insisting. The deeper lesson of Samuelson's legacy isn't that economics became too mathematical. It's that economics became too confident in its own abstractions. Financial systems don't fail because people ignore models. They fail because people believe models eliminate uncertainty. History doesn't repeat because theories are wrong. It repeats because people overestimate how much complexity they've tamed. Understanding Samuelson helps explain why modern economics feels simultaneously powerful, cold, and strangely fragile. It explains why policy often appears certain, until suddenly it isn't. That tension didn't disappear, it intensified. And the way forward isn't to reject expertise, but to refuse the confusion of certainty with wisdom, authority with truth, or models with reality. If this gave you a new way to see the world, don't stop here, because this is only the beginning. If you want to understand how finance, power, and history keep tying themselves into the same knots, subscribe. More stories are coming. Darker stories, more honest stories, the kind that explain why the system feels inevitable until the moment it breaks. Because the answers are still sitting in history, and history never stopped talking.